this paper. It is a knowingly provocative paper which makes a proposal for radical constitutional reform. As such, it has already generated a bit of advanced interest in the media. In particular, there was a piece on the Guardian website by the environment editor, when was that, Friday, I think, which has already garnered over 300 comments. And Rupert has actually printed out not only the piece, but the 300 comments. So if any of you have a spare evening, then it's on the desk over there. There was also a piece on the Daily Telegraph website, on the blog of someone called Brendan O'Neill. Is he here by any chance? No, that's a bit of a shame because might have contributed to a lively debate. I'll just quote from it briefly. The headline reads, "The incredible megalomania of the Green Party. Now they want to speak on behalf of the unborn." I'll make a quick correction here. This has formally got nothing to do, this report has formally got nothing to do with the Green Party. The tenuous connection is that Caroline Lucas, as a member of the House here, is hosting the meeting and has facilitated our use of the room, but that's the end of it. But it starts then saying, "Having utterly failed to win over people in the here and now to their miserablest agenda of humanity baiting and horizon shrinking, Greens are now claiming to represent a constituency that doesn't even exist yet, the unborn. They are cynically seeking to elevate the great unborn over the great unwashed, rallying non-existent people to their increasingly unpopular causes of austerity and misery in lieu of being able to marshal many existing people to such sad causes." So, Rupert, this is Rupert Reed, the author of the report. He's a reader in philosophy at the University of East Anglia, and he's also chair of Greenhouse. Is that a fair description of the report?
Okay, well, thanks, Ray. That's a great question. Thanks to you, thanks to everyone who's made today possible, including, of course, my colleagues in Greenhouse and in the Alliance for Future Generations, of which more anon. So yes, I'm going to provide a fairly brief introduction to the report that I've written. We'll then have a chance to discuss it, as you've heard. I really want to just situate the report in relation to the reasons for it primarily, and give you an idea of my thinking processes that led into it, and then I think you'll see why I came up with the proposals that I did. So, what is the problem that this proposal is designed to address? Well, the first and simplest way of putting it is that we have to find some way of addressing the chronic short-termism of our political culture and of our economics. When we're thinking about things like the electoral cycle, let alone the news cycle, the economic cycle, quarterly reports, these are all kinds of things that incline people to incredibly short time horizons. So this idea is proposed to completely counterbalance those pressures towards short-termism. But there's another basis on which one can think about the basis for this report, for this proposal, and that's in the concept of democracy, and that's where I actually start out in the report. One of the main things I'm really wanting to do is to try to get people to reflect a little more on what we mean by democracy. What is democracy? And for me, the place to start with that is etymology, with the origins of the word. And democracy means, or is supposed to mean, the rule of the people, or the people governing. So the question we ought to ask ourselves is, do the people govern in Britain today? And to ask that question, I think, is pretty quickly to answer it. No, of course they don't. And that immediately suggests a whole raft of changes that probably many of us in this room are already signed up to, that are necessary. For example, a reformed electoral system, a thoroughly reformed upper house, slightly more radically, economic democracy, localization, participatory democracy. These are all the kinds of changes that would be needed to really make a country like Britain worthy of the name democratic, worthy of that word. But there's a problem that remains even after all of those reforms have perhaps been made in some wonderful future that we could imagine 10 years or so from now, perhaps. And that would be that there would be some very substantial constituencies left out of it. Because I want to say that we ought to think about what it means to have a people governing. In other words, who are the people who govern? Now, if the people are only the people who are alive today, if we're thinking of the people or of our society as consisting only of people who are alive today, then I think we're then again thinking in chronically short-termist ways. And we actually ought to think of the people as something which is stretched over this huge, long temporal period, beginning in the past and going off indefinitely into the future. And it's the future people who matter the most because, of course, there isn't a lot that we can do to harm people from the past. They've had their time, and while we should respect their memory and so on and so forth, we can't make their lives terrible or kill them before they're born or anything like that. But we can do that to future people. We can do those things to future people. And the grave danger is that we are doing those things to future people right now. So what I want to suggest is that we ought to find some way of including future people, future generations as yet unborn and born, in our democratic system. And that's the basis, as I see it, of this very radical proposal that I'm making now. How would we do that? So you've got to think about how you would have some kind of equivalent of allowing future people to be able to vote. Clearly, future people actually voting is no more possible than dogs voting. It's in fact even less possible. You could give a dog a whatever, you get the idea. So, we have to give people some kind of proxy equivalent of a vote. And by the way, think about it this way, I would urge you. As long as we don't do completely the wrong thing by future people and prevent them from existing at all, there will, over time, be a very great many more of them than there are of us. In other words, they would outvote us every time. So, this equivalent of a proxy vote, I suggest, ought to be put in the form of a proxy veto. Right? If they got together, they would be able to outvote us every time. So, a proxy veto to ensure the basic needs of future people. That's how I got to this concept. How are you going to instantiate that? Well, you need to have some group of people which are able to represent the needs, the basic interests of future people, and exercise that proxy veto. How are you going to select those people? Well, of course, you could elect them, but that would get into competition with our existing democratic institutions. And there's no particular reason for thinking that election is a good idea with regard to these representatives, because election is a way in which we, the present people, reflect our interests, desires, etc. And it's not a way in which future people are naturally, as it were, getting represented or having their views, basic needs, etc. expressed. We need to have some group of people who are designated as a group of people who are suitable for exercising this proxy veto. And my suggestion is that the only sane way to pick those people, rather than by election, is by random selection, by the same principle that animates the jury system. That is, of course, an intimate part of our democracy as we have it at the present time, insofar as we do have it. So, that's the proposal. A super jury to reflect the basic needs and interests of future people, to be able to exercise a proxy veto on their behalf over legislation, to provide a test to ensure that whatever we do, whatever major steps we take in an institution such as this in which we are standing tonight, is future-proofed. And these people should be selected, as I say, like a jury, by random sortition, which, by the way, of course, was exactly the mechanism which was the main mechanism for democracy to work in Athens, which is well known as the birthplace of democracy. So there's no particular reason why democracy has to mean election. Democracy can mean random selection, sortition. It did in Athens, it could do again here and now, and it still animates our system through the jury system. So that's really it, that's my proposal. A super jury to represent the fundamental interests of future people, selected at random from any of us, so that nobody can say, oh, it's just those posh people, or it's just those people who have been appointed by the government, or it's just those people who are rich or well-connected enough to be elected, or anything like that. All of us, any of us, whether we're young, whether we're old, whether we're educated, whether we're not, are equally qualified and equally ill-qualified to be in this position of having to try to connect with what future people really need and start to put it into action. These people would have a period of training, they would have access to the very best of expertise to support them. Everybody, scientists, philosophers, activists, etc., would want to try to advise this super jury of guardians for future generations. I think it could work. I've set out in the report in some detail how I think that. we're also hoping to open here a space for debate. This is not the kind of proposal that is going to be brought in tomorrow. Too often it seems to me, it seems to us at Greenhouse, think tanks spend a lot of their time thinking, how can we propose something which will be looked upon by this government, or at most the next government, as something which could plausibly be instituted. And that stops them too often from thinking visionary thoughts, from really trying to change the agenda, from really trying to open up the debate. That's very much what we're trying to do here. If a proposal like this was brought in by this government or the next government, great. But even if it isn't, the thing that we need to do right now, it seems to us, is urgently to open up the terrain of this kind of debate. So this is intended not just to be a proposal that will be brought in, but also a proposal to open people's minds and to spark a debate. Looking by the pages of The Guardian and The Telegraph, it's already done that, and I hope to have more of it this evening. Thanks for your time, and let's get the debate started.
Thanks very much. If you're already on fire with questions, then hold on for a couple more minutes. We've asked two people to make brief commentaries on the paper, both of whom have contributed in different ways to its getting to where it is today. First is Nicolo Voyevoda from the Alliance for Future Generations, and after him Peter Roderick will speak. He's the author of a report called Taking the Longer View, which Rupert drew on in writing his own report. So Nicolo first.
Thank you, and thank you for allowing me to say a few words about the Alliance for Future Generations, which comes actually very easy because Dr. Reed's paper has in its roots the same roots that are behind the Alliance for Future Generations, which is, on one hand, the concern that there's a real risk of short-termism in current UK policy processes and democracy, and that undermines the needs of future generations. And this despite the fact that, as a recent Ipsos Mori poll proved or supported, people, ordinary citizens, do care about leaving a better world behind. So in this case, governments and its structures are lacking behind more than people's sentiments. And on the other hand, the other core tenet of the Alliance work is that there's a hope and conviction that there are alternatives to overcome those risks. There are alternatives, and they need to be brought to light, just like in this debate tonight. That's how the Alliance started its work in March 2011 and grew to more than 40 members between organizations and individuals. Under the leadership of a lot of individuals and organizations, but mostly Helena there, and the Foundation for Democracy and Sustainable Development, and an alliance that includes as its members also Dr. Reed and Carolyn Lucas. And it's really grown into a place for both debate, as exemplified by the event tonight, but also collaboration. One of the things that the Alliance has been working on lately is an open challenge paper that was submitted to the Rio +20 consultation. And perhaps as a sign that these issues are starting to see some resonance in the international community, is that in the recent zero draft of the Rio +20 summit, of the UN Conference for Sustainable Development that's happening in the summer, there is indeed a mention of an ombudsperson for future generations. So signs like this are very positive and welcome evidence that discussions like these are even more important. Especially considering how the submission of the Alliance included the proposal to have a High Commissioner for Future Generations, which echoes this proposal and many others. So on a personal level, I can only say that I think that the Alliance should put forth more food for thought, just like Rupert's discussion paper tonight, and I'm looking forward to the discussion tonight.
Thank you.
I've got a message here from Shandor Philip, who is the man elected by the Hungarian Parliament to be the Commissioner for Future Generations. And I'll read out just the beginning and the ending of that. People are welcome to read it afterwards. It says, "It is my regret that I cannot take part in this event because of organisational and financial reasons. My heart is with you, and I fully support the idea developed by Mr. Reid about the guardians of future generations. The Hungarian Ombudsman for Future Generations, the New Zealand Environmental Parliamentary Commissioner, the Israeli and the Finnish Parliamentary Commissions for Future Generations, the New Jersey Chief Environmental Prosecutor, the Austrian and Canadian Regional, National and Environmental Ombudspersons, similar organisations planned in Wales and Malta, were, are and will be good examples for institutional solutions that seem to spread out in the world. Even more important, if they could get a global counterpart, a guardian or high representative for future generations somewhere in the organisational structure of the United Nations and also some of the regional administrations such as the EU. I'm convinced that we shall keep fighting for more such institutional innovations in the name of intergenerational justice and also in the name of our present constitutional values and the basic human sense and interests. Our ancestors were able to live in peace with nature and with their past and future generations. We have to learn it again and to recreate these functions and institutions that serve our survival. This is our only chance. We should not miss it." And I must say I'm very pleased to have been involved with Rupert in the development of his paper from the legal point of view and the constitutional law point of view. And when he first mentioned the idea to me, after falling off my chair and spluttering my samosa across the table, I slowly he's kind of slowly won me over to the idea, as I would formulate it, of having people based in the legislature who have to take the longer view. I remain to be convinced totally by the argumentation on the grounds of representation, because I think it is about how we here and now behave, how our minds work, what our values are, how we make decisions. We don't need, as it were, to have the concept of representation. I think it's about us and our behaviour. I'm also slightly, not totally won over by the idea of a veto. I think when it's put in terms of a veto, the idea that there will be people placed in the legislature who can say no, that sounds rather strong. But then when you think about it as well, until we had the Parliament Acts, until we had a House of Lords vested in the land who didn't like Lloyd George's land reform plans, we used to have a veto, effectively. We needed both houses of Parliament to say yes. And then the Parliament Act came in, and then we tend to think, yes, of course, the House of Commons is supreme. So I'm not totally opposed to the idea of a veto. I think it would be very interesting to hear from comparative constitutional lawyers, for example, and how other legislatures work. But I think there's lots of very interesting things there. But I think basically, Rupert, I think you've done a great service to us in kicking off this kind of discussion. And it seems to be unanswerable that the long-term interest have to be put into our system, and we have to find the best way we can to represent that systematically within the lawmaking process. And this is a great start to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's a nice arc within Rupert's report that it draws not only on ancient Athenian democracy, but on one of the younger Eastern European democracies and their experience as well, as we heard in the letter there. So, over to you for questions and comments. We'll get an indication first of how many people fall to begin with. You were first.
Hi, I'm Joe Hall from the campaign to make ecocide of crime, to make mass destruction of the environment of crime, both for ourselves and for future generations.
Can I just thank you for telling us who you are? Because I forgot to ask if you could all do that in case we can follow up afterwards. Thanks very much.
Yeah, of course. I guess when we're thinking of future generations, there's something that's inherently, you use the word visionary group in your introduction, something creative and visionary. And I've only been able to have a brief flick through the report so far, but the emphasis seems to be more on the veto, on blocking powers, which seems important. But I wonder, how do we really, if we believe in this argument, how do we really take this to conclusions where we have systematically systems and people in place who can really be that creative force for creating the visionary new legislation and ideas for the future generations? And I guess a kind of follow on from that, maybe to the politicians when they speak, is should we take this further? Should there be a cabinet post or the minister for future generations and a shadow minister in each party?
Thank you. Do you want to say that straight away?
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is that there is some stuff in the report that addresses this. I think that it is important that the guardians are not seen as being only negative in the way that they operate. So I suggest that they could be given the power, either individually or collectively or in small groups. These kinds of details will be worked out obviously much later, to initiate legislation. And this would be a positive thing. They could also be given the power, which is a power which, roughly speaking, the Hungarian Ombudsman has, to undertake large-scale processes of research and things like that that could be directed towards the needs of future generations. So those would be a couple of examples. But basically, I absolutely agree with you.
So there were two questions growing already. I think the woman lady were next. Yeah, in the second row from the back.
Hi, I'm Amy Wally from UNICEF UK. I just want to pick up on something you said, Rupert, about how we would select these guardians and then potentially randomly as a jury and then train them up so that they could act as representatives of future generations. Now, it seems to me I was thinking about how we might train these people up and enable them to represent people, and it feels like the most obvious way in order to get people to think about future generations is really for them to think about their children, their grandchildren. What would they want for their grandchildren? Which kind of leads me on to another question, which is when we think about future generations, do today's children fit? Because they're not actually involved in democracy. They don't have a voice. So I think it's important when we talk about future peoples, we are thinking about today's children. I mean, in some of the world's developing countries, that's over 50% of the population. Yeah, they don't get a say. So, yeah, I think balancing the two.
Yeah, again, that's a lovely question. Thank you. There are different ways one can go with this. One could make the remit of the guardians restricted to unborn future generations. I would actually prefer to have it be to do with all future people. And that actually means everybody. But some of us are not going to be future people for as long as others. Namely, for example, the older people in the room. Unfortunately, this comes to us all. So this would mean that when you're thinking, for example, about the year 2100, that seems a reasonable year to be thinking about. In terms of future people, in terms of future generations. Well, of course, there are already people who are alive today who are going to be still around in 2100. So I think that in that way, we should have a kind of idea that the younger somebody is, the closer they are to being, if you like, a full-scale future person. Another dimension of this to do with children, which is interesting, is that one might think quite creatively about how young the guardians can be. Now, I haven't put this in the report because this is incredibly controversial. I've kind of assumed in the report that the youngest they would be is 18. But why should we necessarily take that for granted? For example, it's an extremely striking fact that in Britain today the age of criminal responsibility is 10. Well, if you're old enough to be criminally responsible for things, then you can go to prison, basically, and so on and so forth. Are we sure that you're not old enough to exercise some sort of responsible, visionary role in a process like this? In other words, what I'm getting at is it clear that it would be a mistake to enable some people who are not even 18 to be guardians? And I'm not sure it's at all clear. I think that's, again, something which would be really interesting to debate and think about.
It strikes me there's an interesting point there, which is like almost the reverse of economic discounting, isn't it? We normally discount downwards the further we go in the future. You could almost argue that future generations, the further away they are from us, you have to discount upwards.
Yes, well, I won't go too far on that front. I think that people who are alive in 10 million years' time, let's hope there are some, I think they're going to mostly have to take care of themselves. I think what we should be worried about is what we can foresee as being potential harms to future people. So one very obvious example would be something like nuclear power. So when you're talking about a form of power that produces poisonous waste that lasts for hundreds of thousands of years, that, it seems to me, is a clear example of an issue which is pretty ill-served by our current political institutions. And as Peter was saying, it would be great to have a place in those political institutions where there were people who were required and empowered to take a longer view. I rather suspect that they would take a dim view of nuclear power.
Okay, I think that the earliest question was also in the row next to the last one there. Yeah, that's you.
Thank you very much. I'm Alex Worley-Lack. I'm a political scientist at the University of Surrey. And I'd like to ask a question about the joined-up nature of governance and how you see your proposal for super juries to represent future generations to fit in with the context in which political power actually operates. I saw, just from looking at your report, that you talked a little about multi-level governance in a way looking at the local level, and some very interesting thoughts there about connecting up local and national. But what about connecting up with international issues and international structures? For example, what would you do if, for example, in Westminster, your committee was formed and decided that something shouldn't be done in the interest of future generations, and yet you had a contrary vote at, say, European level? Or vice versa, what would you do if in the European Parliament were there to be a suitable and similar committee set up, and they decided something was against the interest of future generations, and yet a British committee or a German committee or even a Scottish committee in the future perhaps decided that it wasn't? What mechanisms would you have for trying to reconcile the decisions that such juries would make when the competence or the legal competence for those decisions isn't wholly within national keeping?
Yeah. Well, so partly this comes to what Nicola was talking about, right? It's implicit in my report that there's no particular reason to think that there should only be some kind of guardian-like institutions at national level, but also, as you said, at local level and at international level, and maybe we're starting to move in that direction. Your question is very interesting, Alex, although I think to some extent it's not a question that I have to answer, in the sense that to some extent it's simply a question of, well, what do you do when you get conflicts between different levels of power? And that's a kind of question for anyone interested in political institutions or constitutional matters. I will just highlight one thing in particular, which I do address in the report, which we had a long and fascinating debate about within the Alliance for Future Generations, which is, what about the Human Rights Act and the European Court of Human Rights? And basically the way I've come down on that, which I think is satisfactory, is that there should be a right of appeal from the guardians to the European Court of Human Rights. But there should also be reform of the European Court of Human Rights, such that they include taking future generations seriously within their remit as well, which at present they basically don't. And there is some movement apparently in that direction. I think that movement has to be continued. It wouldn't be any good, it seems to me, to have the European Court be able to veto the guardian if the European Court is not open to considering the basic interests and needs of the future generations to come.
The questions are multiplying. We are going to have comments shortly from at least 2 parliamentarians, hopefully 3. So if your question is on, as it were, the political practicality or political reactions to these proposals, perhaps you'd like to save that, because we'll have another longer round after that. Have I succeeded in reading that down to a manageable number? Okay, well I suggest I take the first 4 I saw, 2, 3, there's a good compromise. And I think that's the gentleman in the back row, the lady in the second from the back row, and the guy in the corner. Yeah, can we have those questions together, and then we'll try and have a brief round up. So, your turn.
My name is Chit Chung. I'm a member of the Alliance for Future Generations and past speaker for Future Generations for the Green Party. What I would like to add, debate, is that to couch it in where we are now and what we have done already to future generations. Because the language should not really be about us creating this veto for future generations, but as a matter for restitution for the damage that we have already done, and actually to change the language from one of the elders giving to the future generations, but for us as the elders trying to correct the damage that we have already done, because it is actually a case of intergenerational oppression in the same way that the imperialistic powers of old enslaved the developing countries.
Okay, and the next was, yes, please.
Okay, my name's Melanie Strickland. I'm from an organisation called Wild Law UK, and we promote and advocate earth-centred governance or eco-centric governance. I'm also a member of the Occupy London Environment Working Group, but I'm not speaking in that capacity. As you will have got from Wild Law, I think what you put forward is a very important contribution to the debate, but if by future generations you just include people, that is too narrow, because we co-evolved with millions of other species over millennia, and I believe that they have nature needs a voice in our democracy, and I wondered if you had thought about the other species as well.
Thank you.
My name is James Garvey. I write about ethics and climate change. I just have a very happy suggestion for you, not a question really. I like what you did. You sort of argued that given what democracy means, we're already committed to the notion that we have to look after future people. I like that. I was thinking about how this notion is maybe expanding in the world. It occurred to me that my American brothers and sisters are similarly committed. In the preamble of the Constitution is that line, "We the people of the United States."
It's in one of the footnotes.
Is it?
Yeah.
Fantastic. If you haven't read the footnotes, I'll it says we secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity.
Yeah.
So in a sense, it seems like the American Constitution has built this notion into it, and it might be something to usefully exploit in the future.
Thanks, James. Yeah, totally agree. On the other two questions, the enslavement point, well, as you can tell from the title of the Guardian piece, if you've seen that, I basically agree. I think we have to be clear about just how bad we are at risk of making things for future people. And I think enslavement is a good analogy, a provocative one, but a good one. Because to enslave people is to force them to work really hard for your benefit or at your behest. And that is what is in danger of happening to future people. They may be forced really hard to work really hard just to survive. And finally, on the question about nature and human animals, I do very briefly address this in the report. I completely agree that that the other great class, if you like, of voiceless beings that deserve some kind of place in our democratic thinking are non-human animals. In terms of nature and ecosystems, my own view is an interesting debate we could have. My own view is that the best way to think about their place in our system is as absolutely essential preconditions for the well-being of non-human animals and of human animals, i.e. us. And in that sense, it seems to me that taking future people seriously necessitates taking ecosystems seriously. There's no way of avoiding that. But I rather suspect that actually the best way to get people to take ecosystems seriously is going to be through getting them first, at least, to take future people seriously. So that's the sort of strategic impulse, if you like, behind, if you like, the order of priority which I'm taking things here. But thank you so much for the question. We can discuss it more.
Okay, thanks very much. I should add that Rupert is an academic, so there's a hell of a lot of footnotes there.
Or a lot more before you make it.
I'd like at this point then to ask the three UK parliamentarians who've kindly agreed to come along to give brief comments, and after that we'll move to another round, so there are lots of questions already. First, because she got us the room, it's Caroline Lucas, Second, because he got here from the start, is John Cruddas. And third, I'm pleased to say Norman Baker is now also here. Caroline.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to say a few words and to share some thoughts around the publication of Rupert's report. And I hope very much that it will stimulate a much needed debate on an idea that needs to be discussed not just in these forums but much, much more widely. And that idea, of course, is essentially around how we challenge the short-termism of the current political system and how we work out a way of incorporating a long-term perspective into all the decisions that we make. And I think in an era of focus group obsession, it's about how we think about the impact of a policy not just 5 weeks hence or 5 months hence, but 50 years hence and 500 years hence. And I think it is important that we discuss it thoroughly and seriously, because governing with future generations in mind is a huge part of what it means to be green, I think. But in some ways, if I can risk being a bit controversial, they can also appear to contradict everything that I hold dear as a progressive, as a radical, as a believer in democracy. And so I think it's quite tricky, the kind of challenge that this debate poses for us, that governing on behalf of future generations puts two of the most fundamental democratic ideals, in some sense, in contradiction with one another. And I'll try to explain what I mean. Rupert has quoted Edmund Burke at the opening of the report, saying society is a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, those who are yet to be born. And of course, governments of every colour have become accustomed to simply fighting fires, of not doing what Edmund Burke suggests, of doing whatever is necessary to keep voters on their side by the time the next election rolls around. For parliamentarians today, the present is what matters. And if that means making life difficult for future generations, then that's essentially their problem. And of course we do in the present do a lot of clearing up of messes left by the last lot. Yet it's increasingly clear, I think, that we can't carry on thinking like that. The actions of the dead, the living and the as yet unborn are all connected, and unless we kick the habit of leaving messes around for the next generation to clear up, then I think the planet and our descendants will face untold suffering. But having said that, I think it's also worth remembering that to some extent Burke was speaking as an arch-conservative. He was speaking in defence of tradition, of stability, of the status quo. He was seeking to demolish the kind of radical revolutionary democratic ideals of liberty and self-determination that we've come to cherish. Thomas Paine, that great champion of democracy and freedom, responded to Burke's conservatism by saying, "The vanity and presumption of governing beyond the grave is the most ridiculous incident of all times." Something not quite as eloquently was said by the Telegraph.
Yes.
And there will be many of those who at first glance will see this proposal that we govern with the needs of future generations in mind as anathema to our fundamental democratic instincts, a sort of governing beyond the grave in reverse. Why should we prioritise the needs of future generations ahead of those of the current generation? How dare we presume to shape the world our descendants will live in? Don't we trust them to take care of their own needs the way we have to take care of ours? And isn't this future people stuff just another attempt on the part of eco-fascists to tell us what to do? Now, I wouldn't use that language, but I do have a few concerns, I have to say, about the Guardians as an answer. Some of the concerns have already been raised in the room. But I do think that the question which Rupert and his colleagues are seeking to ask is absolutely crucial. And the publication of this report is absolutely vital to the process of how we answer it. So whether or not we think the Guardians is an answer, whether or not we think an ombudsperson is the answer, whether or not we think that modern language like the European the Declaration of Human Rights is the answer, I think all of those are still up for grabs and part of the debate. And I think that by putting his views on the table so clearly and eloquently, I think Rupert forces us to think, well, if it's not that, for those of us who think, well, it's not that, then what is it? And I think that debate is a really, really important one to be had. Because, of course, the truth is that we already shape the world of our descendants in all sorts of malign, short-sighted and self-interested ways. We do it every time we dump nuclear waste, and we do it every time we raise a forest or make room for a motorway, or tariff planning regulations for the sake of short-term economic growth. And it's that kind of governing beyond the grave that really is the most ridiculous and insolent of all tyrannies. And I think I just leave you with the thought that, of course, there is an alternative form of governing beyond the grave. You felt the benefit of it every time you sat in the park under the shade of a mature oak or walked down an avenue of broad-leafed limes. The people who planted those trees did so in the knowledge that they would never live to enjoy them fully grown, but they planted them anyway, because they knew that someday someone else would enjoy them. I think if you think of the gratitude you feel to such far-sighted, selfless people, and the challenge is for us ourselves to become such people. And I think we must give the people of the future something to be grateful to us for. And so I want to thank Rupert again for stimulating this debate. I think it's an absolutely vitally important one. It's needed more than ever before as I sit here in a parliament which shocks me on a daily basis by the incredibly short-termism of its thinking. If we had a bit more of this kind of thinking inserted into our processes, I think it would be a very good thing.
Thanks, Ray. Well, I'll be very brief. Partly because I'm here to listen, actually, because I find the report slightly uncomfortable, which is good, and sort of counterintuitive in a way as a politician. I was just listening to what Caroline said. I echo very much what she was saying. But when you're talking about tradition, I start thinking about sitting in here, in the, the epicentre of so many British traditions. It brought back the sort of phrase used by Chesterton to talk about tradition as the democracy of the dead. And what is the opposite to that? And it seems to me that's what we're sort of trying to battle with in terms of generational obligations. And I go back to that quote you recited at the beginning around the telegraph, actually, in that the immediate response is because this generation is doing everything so well that it doesn't need to confront some of the questions of the almost epochal generational transfers that are going on in real time today. And that's why this is such a challenging but vital contribution. Yeah, it goes back to the short-termism, obviously economically, obviously ecologically, but also culturally, in terms of patterns of consumption and use and everything being disposable, and the shrinking of the time horizons that we're all living within. And you need correctives to try and unwind that, and that's what I think this report does. That's why I sort of commend it as a really sort of incendiary proposition. I quite like the idea that it confronts the inverse relationship between the scale of the crisis and the remedies at hand, because we do not seem to be awash with significant, profound interventions in terms of policy remedies across the front, really. And that's not meant as a political thing. I think it's a generic critique of the body politic because of the short-termism, the parliamentary cycles that everyone operates within, the news cycles, etc., etc. So I think it's good because it's a big idea and we're not awash with that. So all power to your elbow. I do think it fits into quite an interesting, broader perspective around electoral reform, really introducing people into this conversation politically, how you do it, given that the stakes are so high. I had some questions in terms of the specifics, in terms of the juries and patterns of report and contest and the like, and whether an ombudsman is better, and how we can learn from comparative experiences being in Hungary or Israel or Bolivia or whatever, or what's going on. But I do think because it shakes you as a proposition, it's interesting, so therefore I'm sort of drawn to it. I had this thing, you talk about Thomas Paine, it's really, I just finished John Keats's biography of Thomas Paine, and the colleague in the corner was talking about the American Constitution. He, of course, was a great friend of Thomas Jefferson. And you do think that these great pioneers of the 18th century actually would have had the capacity to consume big ideas, gestate, and come up with their own responses. And that says something about the shrinkage of the political franchise and the ideas, and our collective memories, actually, and our capacity to come up with new remedies. And this is precisely whether, in fact, you would agree with it singularly or parts of it or whatever, that's not really the point. The point is to contest space, to put things in, to percolate in the mix, and actually to return in a few years' time and see what effect it has. So all power to you. I think it's a really interesting intervention. Again, I return to my slight discomfort at this, the questions it raises, but that's good. And I think we should give it as a wide and a deeper area as we can to try and sort of see it can be. We should have hundreds of these sorts of ideas rather than just one or two that we seek to nurture. So good luck to you, and I congratulate you for taking yourself as well as Rupert. I think it's a really timely intervention, and I'm listening and learning as well. Thanks.
Well, first of all, can I say I'm sorry I wasn't here for the first bit. I'm sorry I wasn't here for the last bit either, because there's things going on I've got to go and do with High Street Rail and everything else. But I wanted to come along because this is an important issue. It's an issue which has bothered me for some time, the question of the environment. Take the Brundtland approach, the environment we pass on to future generations should be better or as good as the one we inherited. That seems to me to be absolutely the right approach to life. Not very different to the Edmund Burke quote, though I've never associated Grohan Brundtland with Edmund Burke until this evening, so that's a novel association I've created myself tonight. And that is a very important question, and like Caroline, I share the concern about short-termism in politics. It's always worried me that, and there's always been a tension between the democratic deficit, if you like, the democratic need to ensure people are regularly held to account for what they do. And Thomas Paine had plenty of things to say about that. Who elected you? How can we get rid of you? I think the two questions he asked. I'm delighted to see, by the way, that the son of Lewis has migrated to Dagenham and indeed across Brighton as well, from Lewis and indeed from Thetford, if people might say, where he was born. And I have to say that what Thomas Paine said 200 years ago is relevant today as it was then, which is the true mark of somebody who's very well focused. The short term in politics means that sometimes people say we can't afford to look after the environment, we've got to make sure we've got jobs tomorrow. That's absolutely the wrong approach. Absolutely the wrong approach. And those who say, I'm talking in slightly oblique language, that we need to forget about the environment or downplay the environment because of the economy are absolutely wrong. They're absolutely wrong morally, but they're absolutely wrong in economic terms as much as anything else, because the economy of the future depends on us providing a stable, sustainable planet, and that means actually minimising our environmental footprint whilst trying not to sacrifice our living standards. That's what we've got to try and do. It's not very easy, but that's what we've got to try and do. So, how do we get to this ideal that Brundtland set out, President Burke set out, and Rupert's question set out for us tonight in his interesting approach? And how do we contrast that with the majority view in the country, I have to say, and the short-termism of politics? And it is a majority view in the country, and I'm not hidebound by focus groups anymore than anybody else, but I have to say, if you look at the stats, when you ask what people are interested in, and those questions, even when they're asked neutrally, the environment comes way, way down at the moment. And people have decided, a lot of people have decided, the environment is an extra, and while we're sorting out the economy, we can't afford to have the environment. I totally reject that argument, but I have to say that is a view which is widely held, not just in this place, but out there in the country. And therefore I suspect if we had 12 people good and true, they wouldn't necessarily come up with the answers which we would like to come up with in terms of how they might approach the priorities. We don't necessarily want a green elite, I think, Rupert, to use your phrase, but nevertheless, that is, I think, what we come up with. And even if you had people good and true who did share my view, and the view of many in this room, I'm sure, about having the environment protected for future generations, in the same condition as now, preferably better, to that effect, then there are difficult issues. I mean, high-speed rail is one of the issues today. What's the conclusion on that? I happen to think that environmentally it is a plus. But there are others who put forward arguments to say, well, you're freeing up slots at Heathrow and that's more long-term flights and everything else. So it's not entirely black and white on a major issue like that. And that requires a deep level of analysis, which is a lot to ask a small group of people picked at random to conclude. There are issues with jury trials about fraud cases and whether or not they're able to, and got the time, to absorb hugely complex issues for one case. If you're asking people to look at the whole gamut of policies far and wide, that's a lot to ask for. That's not to downplay the idea, which I think is very interesting, but it's to say, how can we perhaps, a bit like Caroline actually, how can we achieve what you want to achieve? And is there other ways of doing it? Democracy was at Churchill, the worst form of government apart from all others. There's some truth in that. And whatever the faults of this place, and they are many and varied, I have to say it's got better than it was. It should have seen in 97 when I arrived, when people were walking around with top hats and in the division bell, when the division bell went. We moved on from that, unfortunately, not very much, not far enough. But at least people in this place are elected, okay, through an inadequate voting system, an unfair voting system that doesn't give full weight to different strands of opinion, which gives far too many safe seats to individual parties up and down the country, where one house is unelected still. And I remember saying to someone last week, in a TV debate, we must get on with house laws reform, and I was accused of hurrying things up too far. Well, I've been trying for 100 years since 1911, so I didn't really hurry it up too much. We've got to sort out these constitutional problems, because actually getting the constitutional issues right are the foundations for a good democracy which involves people properly in a way that presently doesn't occur. That includes the House of Lords, it includes electoral reform, it includes extensions, in my view, to freedom of information. So I look at what the democratic system can produce, faulty as it is, and I look at things like the Climate Change Act, which I think has been a good example of where you can plan for the future, where there are targets, governments of the future are being held to, which they're required to report to Parliament and required to state what's happening, and that was a cross-party effort. I was happy to be the Lib Dem who promoted that, but the Labour MP and a Tory MP as well, to take that forward in the last Parliament. And that was largely done with cross-party cooperation. When you look at what the position is in other countries where people deny climate change still, or if they advocate action, they're a minority, we've got the establishment, if you like, in this country signed up to the concept of climate change, and they need to take action, and that's a major achievement for this country. So that's one way in which the democratic system, it seems to me, has worked. The Environmental Audit Committee, which I used to sit on, is another example of a cross-cutting arrangement with democratic accountability and some oomph, which has got the capacity to hold governments, certainly, but beyond that, industry and others, to account. We look at international obligations, enforceable ones, like the Kyoto Treaty, and hopefully what might come as a follow-on to that. So these aren't perfect solutions, but I'm quite clear that they have got democratic legitimacy of some sort. And I think if we're going to be able to make progress, we have to have that democratic legitimacy in order to persuade people that this is where we are going. So I want to explore those avenues and see how those might be further improved. And excuse me if I have to go before very long.
On that very point, thank you very much. I know you have to head off shortly. I know Rupert wanted to respond directly to a couple of your points. You comfortable with that?
Of course.
You may not get another report.
Yeah, just very quickly, thanks so much to Caroline and John. I'll just let their remarks stand. Just very quickly on 2 points that Norman has raised there. One, the point about people say the economy is more important than the environment. That comes back, I think, to the question we had before about nature and ecosystems and our children and our children's children. Part of what I'm trying to suggest is if we actually find a way, and I think this might be part of the way, to get people to think about what their children's children and their children's children's children, future people, need, then we might start to change that. We might start to get people to think, well, actually, the economy isn't more important if it means that my grandchildren are going to be stuffed. And the second point, very quickly, is you're of course absolutely right that we can't know that the super jury would make what some of us in this room would think of as the right decisions. And that, of course, is a gamble that one always takes with any democratic mechanism. And I want to suggest that super jury where people could think, that actually might be me, and some of the people on that are like me. Whereas actually, of course, parliamentarians tend to come from an extremely restricted proportion of the population. Both especially age-wise, for example, virtually all parliamentarians are between about 35 and 65 now. There are virtually none who are very young or very old, as people on the super jury could be. I actually think that if we said, this could be you, and if you were trained and expertly advised, and if you took an oath to do your best to make things okay for the basic needs of future generations, I actually think that's as good as hope as we may have for something which would be enough to do that. But let's carry on talking about it.
Okay, I say, Norm has to leave shortly. Sorry. Take this point to say thank you very much to the three parliamentarians. Extremely helpful. Right, there were already quite a few indications of people wanting to speak. Can I see roughly how many we have? Right, we've got 15 to 20 minutes. So can I take Mayor first?
Thank you. I just want to firstly congratulate everybody who's been involved in getting this subject onto the political and hopefully the public agenda. Now, many of us who've been writing about it for many years ago have totally failed. So it's a joy to hear a meeting in this place talking on such issues. But it seems to me that what Rupert's report does is to open, I don't know whether it's a hornet's box or a hornet's nest or a Pandora's box. And I'll just cite very quickly two aspects of it. The first one is related to the finite nature of the atmosphere to absorb the further burning of fossil fuels, and indeed the finite nature of mineral reserves. If one takes into account the claims of future generations, and hopefully we need to think about future generations as being an infinite number, then there is no doubt at all that to share those out, factor in the claims of future generations on those finite situations, means that we have got to go for zero emissions, or as close to zero emissions as good as zero emissions, both of from the burning of fossil fuels and from the using of fossil fuels. And the last thing we need to be doing is to be seeking to extract more fossil fuels, as the major oil and gas companies are attempting to do, because if to burn those is going to make the situation even worse for future generations. And once one factors those in, then it altogether totally, I'm sorry Norman Baker's gone, but I mean the proposition that an 80% reduction of emissions by 2050 is an adequate answer to this finite nature and the sharing out of that with future generations. So that's one point that I think needs the subject of considerable debate, not appropriate in a situation where the chairman is thinking I'm going on talking too long when there's a limited time to be so. But the other point I wanted to make was in relation to Rupert's proposition on the representation of spokespersons. Yes, very quickly, representation of spokespersons in the way that it is set out, if I understand it correctly, it would be a UK jury? Pardon?
Yeah.
Well, if it's a UK jury, but these are issues affecting populations of third world far more than populations of first world like ours, and from that perspective, it's almost an imperialistic judgment that we in the West know far better how to consider the claims of future generations in the third world. And I think from that perspective, I would far rather see people of, let's say, the Mandela class, so to speak, selected because they are voted into as being the best people that the world can think of as representing the future, would be a better way of going about it than through the democratic process.
Let me respond to that. Of course, the first problem with that proposal, Mayor, is that you don't know who people would vote in. Maybe they were voting Mandela, or maybe they were voting Clarkson. And so that's one of the reasons why...
That's why democracy will fail in this instance, because it's quite likely that people will not be prepared to accept a future in which they are obliged to live on zero carbon emissions.
Well, that may be true. I think that the best prospects we have as a democracy for doing what needs to be done, which you're absolutely right about, is something like what I'm talking about. I think this kind of idea, where people think, well, I could be one of those guardians, my name could be picked out of the hat, might actually be the kind of thing that could create buy-in where you wouldn't get it for something like an ombudsman or a constitutional entrenchment. To come back to your previous point, which is of course related, I've worded this report for something like the UK, but I have specifically said in the report, as we discussed briefly, very briefly earlier, that these guardians, or something like them, should also operate on a local level and should also operate on an international level. And we come back again to what Niccolo said in that general or vague direction. One reason for thinking that guardians at the UK level would, without being imperialistic, would actually think about questions on a more global basis, which I think would be a good thing than many of our current parliamentarians do, is the following. If you're actually serious about taking care of people in the UK on a long-term basis, if you're thinking about people in the UK in 200 years from now, then you have to think about global threats seriously. Because basically, as we know, environmental problems don't respect national frontiers. The further you go into the future, the more likely it is that something that happens in another country is going to adversely affect people in this country. So I think willy-nilly, the Guardians would actually have to consider global threats more seriously than our current politicians do. And I take that to be an advantage of the proposal.
Okay. Gentleman there, that's you.
That's me, okay. Thank you, Ray. It's Angus Hanton of the Intergenerational Foundation. I just want to challenge what Norman Baker was saying about what the public think. We did a joint project between the Alliance for Future Generations and the Intergenerational